Hello, and welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and we are delighted to have back with us again virtually author Mia P. Manansala. Did I get that right? No.
Manansala.
Manansala. Thank you for correcting me. I don't know why that's so difficult, but even though I have trouble with her name, I love her books, and she's here for her third in the Tita Rosa mystery series, Blackmail and Bibingka. Is it Bibingka?
Bibingka. Yes, you're correct.
The Poison Pen does have copies of Mia's first two books, Black Homicide and Halo Halo, and Arsenic and Adobe, as well as her new book. And we would love to hold one or more of them for you or put them in the mail. Just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we can connect you with these truly wonderfully entertaining books. And now I'd like to welcome back Mia.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Thank you for visiting us again. I know we've kind of delved into your background, but for those of listening in who might be new to your works, what can you tell us about Mia before you became a writer? I knew you had kind of an interesting background.
Yeah, okay, so for anyone who is new to me, I'm Filipino-American author, born and raised in Chicago. Before becoming a writer, I was an English major in university and an anthropology minor. After I graduated, there's not a whole lot you can do as an English major or anthropology minor. So I spent 3.5 years teaching English in South Korea.
Oh,
Yeah. And it's not until, so I've always loved writing and dreamed of being an author, but I never really took my writing seriously until after my time was up in Korea and I came back home and I was almost 30 and I was just like, and living back with my family again after, all these adventures on the other side of the world. And I was like, oh, what next? And then I remembered how much I loved writing, and that kind of led me to this path.
and you got your love of mysteries, if I remember correctly, from your mother.
Yes, yes. So I grew up in a multi-generational household with my maternal grandparents, my mom's parents, as well as, my mom, dad, brothers, cousins, an aunt or an uncle occasionally. So with my grandparents, they were really into mystery, like media, but like more like TV. So I would watch um, Perry Mason, Matlock, Murder, She Wrote, those kinds of shows with them. My mom was really into Nancy Drew.
Oh,
I got into Encyclopedia Brown on my own as a kid, but then my mom introduced me to Mary Higgins Clark when I was in grade school, and we
oh.
would kind of buddy read books. She was never one of those like, oh, these are adult books. You're a child. You can only like. She was like, if it's in the house, it was fair game.
Hmm,
So I got a lot of my love of mystery from her.
that's great. What was your past education like? Because if I remember correctly, there were signs that you wanted to write mysteries early on when you were a
Mhm.
child, something about the Three Little Pigs.
Oh yeah. So I remember the first story I remember ever completing was it was an assignment for class. I want to say maybe like 5th grade. I couldn't have been much older than that. And it was one of those like do a retelling of like the Three Little Pigs story for a class assignment. And like my retelling was that the big bad wolf was a drug dealer and the Three Little Pigs were trying to take him down. And again, I was like 9 or 10 years old. So
Even then, you were kind of being a bit edgy with the genre.
yeah.
So you decided you wanted to write a book, and this was like 2015 or so, around that time period.
Around that time, yeah, 2015. So I had returned. So I was in South Korea from 2010 to 2014. And then 2015 is when I took my very first writing class,
Oh,
which happened to be a mystery writing workshop. Prior to this, as much as I loved reading mystery, I actually didn't envision myself as a mystery writer. It seemed really hard. I kind of thought I'd be more of a fantasy writer, particularly for middle grade. I really like, the idea of writing for kids. It's not something I haven't shelved that idea yet. It's just, right now mystery is where my heart is and that's what I'm focusing on. But it was a 1-day mystery writing class taught by Lori Rader Day, who was also another Chicago writer.
mhm.
And that class kind of changed everything for me.
Oh. And how long did it take you to get from taking this class, working on your book, to actually getting a publisher saying, we want to buy this?
So the book that I started in Lori's class was not the book that eventually sold. The book I started in Lori's class would go on to become the first novel I ever completed.
Okay.
Um, that it was called Death Comes to Comic-Con. It involved a young Filipino American millennial solving a murder mystery at a Chicago comic book convention. It got me it won the Malice Domestic grant
Oh,
for unpublished writers.
wow.
It got me into a mentorship program called Pitch Wars, where Kelly Garrett became my mentor and really, taught me the craft and about the industry. It got me my first agent, but then it never sold.
Mhm.
For a year and a half, it didn't sell. So for the year and a half that I was in submission and getting endless rejections, I worked on the book that would become Arsenic and Adobo, which was my debut. And so I started Arsenic and Adobo in 2018, and that sold in early 2020.
Tell us a little bit about the launch to this series and your series character.
So Arsenic and Adobo is the first book in the Tita Rosie's Kitchen Mystery series, which is like a lighthearted, humorous, culinary cozy set around a family-owned Filipino restaurant in a fictional town outside of Chicago. So the series starts with me playing around with a lot of rom-com tropes, oddly enough. So speaking of Kelly Garrett, we were talking one day and we noticed that a lot of contemporary cozies seemed to share rom-com tropes. Usually the young or at least youngish woman, almost
Mhm.
always a woman, usually from a small town or at least a tight-knit community, moves to like the bigger world, a big city, has to return back home, usually works some sort of like quirky, family-run business. There's almost always like a romantic subplot of some kind. And so I wanted to play with that. So the first book is almost like I like to call them like rom-coms with dead bodies. And it's almost like a second coming of age. So like my protagonist Lila, she's 25 years old when she returns home after her life her life in Chicago kind of like falls apart. And
Mhm.
it involves her kind of relearning what it is she wants out of life, what family looks like, what home actually means, where her loyalties truly lie. And so, and of course it's a mystery, it involves like her ex-boyfriend who's been trying to get her family's restaurant shut down, um, dying in their restaurant like mid-meal, mid-review, because he's a
Critic.
reviewer.
Yeah.
And so there's like a lot of like little things like that I pulled together. So it's like, it's like, oh, the ex-boyfriend is back in her life. Oh no, but he died. So it's not, I'm playing a lot of these tropes. And so for the second book, she's a little bit more settled now. She's a little bit more sure of her place in the world, but um, I can't have, because it's a series, I don't want her to be static. Right.
Mhm.
Like there always has to be something that, especially because she's so young. I purposely chose such a young protagonist because I want someone with flaws who can learn and grow believably with each book.
Mhm.
Um, so even though there are many things she learned in book one, book two, she's confronting a whole different set of issues, both external and internal. With book two, it's the Miss Teen Shady Palms beauty pageant has returned to town, which she has like an uncomfortable past relationship with, mostly because then it brings up memories of her deceased beauty queen mother and the complicated relationship they had. So if you have noted, like a lot of my books are very much character driven. So yeah, like the mystery plot is there. There's very much investigation. There's the dead bodies. There's a twists and turns and suspects, but it's a lot about how my protagonist is trying to navigate through the world and very much about the family and community ties that help her along the way.
If I understand correctly, Homicide and Halo Halo, which is the second in the series, for that particular book, second book syndrome hit you hard. That was more challenging to write.
Oh, it was so much more challenging. There's so many times I thought it was never going to happen. So, I knew enough about the industry that I knew not to expect things to happen quickly. And that I know that if things happen quickly, it's the exception, not the rule. Case in point, when my first book was on submission, again, a year and a half of submission before we finally let it die.
Mhm.
So and then after that, so I'm on my second agent. So after that book died on submission and I had finished the book that would become Arsenic and Adobo, I sent it to my then agent. she didn't like it. She was very honest with me and told me that, she didn't love it and I deserved someone who did. And I agreed with her. So we had to part ways and I had to query again, found my second agent, and she was the one who eventually went on to sell it.
Yeah.
But because of my previous experience, I was like, okay, when it goes on to submission, it's going to take forever. Don't even think about it. Work on the next thing. So like I had not, I had already prepared for this long wait, and I was going to start, outlining the second book maybe, but then think about a new project. But then Arsenic and Adobo sold at auction in like 2 weeks.
Wow.
Which is almost unheard of, and I absolutely didn't expect it. And so I didn't have time, I didn't have that buffer time to at least work on the second book before I even sold the first. So, I spent a year and a half finishing a draft of Arsenic and Adobo, more than 2 years polishing it through edits and everything. But for Homicide and Halo Halo, I had maybe 5-6 months.
Wow.
And, for this genre, I'm not really a fast writer. I take a little bit more time. I'm a little slower. I'm a many drafts kind of writer, because every time I'm finding something new and I'm layering things in. But now I have deadlines, right? I have a contract that I have to honor. I have before I was writing for myself. And in many ways, I am still writing for myself, right? That's the point of me writing the books that I write.
Wow.
But at the same time, there are still the expectations of my publishers. And I have readers now, right? I have to, there's reader expectations I don't want. There's lots of pressure that I was feeling. And of course, I wrote that second book in 2020.
Other things were
After
going on.
there
Yeah.
was a lot going on. I had gotten laid off from my job because I was working at an international language school teaching English, right? No more international students coming in meant no more. So they shut down the entire Chicago branch. So, loss of a stable income, loss of a stable world, all, regular writing pressures. It was a lot. So I'm very lucky that my team was very supportive when I was just like, I need a little bit more time. I was lucky that I had a lot of good writing friends in the community who were extremely supportive and understood what I was going through and kind of helped me through it. I was very lucky that my husband and my family are incredibly supportive, and like they might not understand, but they're like, we don't know what these terms are you're using, but we're here for you, kind of a thing. So it was rough, but it was truly the people in my life that helped me get through it.
Well, what's amazing is it doesn't show in the final product. So there may have been a lot of kind of like a duck on the surface. Everything's calm. There's a lot of paddling going on underneath.
Yes, absolutely.
Which brings us to the third, which is just out in the series, Blackmail and Bibingka. What can you tell us about this for readers that might not have read it yet?
So in this book, and I mentioned it in the in the author's note, so like both me and Lila are in a better place in our lives, because book 2 deals pretty closely with the after effects of book 1, right? So Lila's in a very dark place. There's a lot of things that she's dealing with, both past and present. Which I kind of like channeled a lot of my emotions into that, which is like, I was going through it, Lila was going through it. It really made sense for that particular book. So with book 3, Blackmail and Bibingka, it was kind of a joy to be like, oh, I can breathe. She's in a better place. Things are not perfect, but things are looking up. And so Blackmail and Bibingka involves the return of her long lost cousin Ronnie, who is her aunt, her Tita Rosie's only child. He had ghosted the family about 15 years ago. He'd always been kind of a problem child. And he suddenly returns one day, like the prodigal son. And of course, Tita Rosie is ready to welcome him back with open arms, but Lila doesn't trust him, right? She knows, like, she's seen this before when he was much younger. She knows that trouble follows always. And of course, she's proven right when, it's not a spoiler, it's literally in the title. Like, Tita Rosie starts getting blackmailed regarding some secrets from Ronnie's past. One of Ronnie had returned to town because he bought a winery, a local winery in Shady Palms. And so, to kind of show like, I'm here for good. I'm starting over. I'm a local business owner now. One of his investors is murdered and he becomes one of the main suspects. And so it's on Lila to help and I mentioned before that he was a bit of a problem child, so he's not a very well-liked figure in the Shady Palms Police Department. Like the sheriff has had a history with him in the past.
Mm.
And so, Lila's family kind of knows that it's very
Yeah.
unlikely he's not going to get a fair shake just due to their past. So she's not doing it for him. She's doing it for her aunt, who truly believes in her son and innocence. And so she's like, okay, your family, I
Mhm.
guess for your mom,
Mhm.
I'm gonna help you out. And so like that kind of kicks off the investigation.
It's another terrific addition to the series. Ronnie comes back to open the winery, and I had no idea there was such a thing. I probably won't get the correct term right, but coconut wine is a thing.
Yeah, it's called like lambanog.
Yeah.
It's like a coconut wine, coconut liqueur that's like popular in the Philippines around Christmas time.
Okay.
And so it seemed like a perfect, like, of course, like Illinois has quite a few wineries. So I was like, let me
Didn't
make
know that
use.
either.
Yeah. I know it's really surprising, right? You would think maybe California, maybe upstate New York, but Illinois, I actually visited a few wineries in Illinois, in Galena, Illinois, and the research that I have to do to kind of like make it feel a little bit more real. And so I was like, I wanted to take advantage of like the Midwest setting, but like, as usual, bring in a bit of the Filipino culture and
Mhm.
infusing it in the story.
You mentioned it's set at Christmas,
Hmm.
and I do have some wonderful holiday notes woven into the story. One of the, I guess it's a tradition, and you'll get the pronunciation correctly. I won't. Simbang Gabi is
Simbang Gabi, yeah. It literally means like 9 nights. So Gabi is night, Simbang is like that is number 9.
okay.
And it's mostly like a holdover from like Spanish colonialism, Spanish Catholicism, and it's like 9 nights of masses leading up to the big event of like Christmas Eve, Christmas
Oh.
Day. And it's on in many ways, like my family personally, like my immediate family did not celebrate it, but that's because like my mom worked retail, so like like that time. But you know um outside family and family friends did, and it's basically, it sounds boring. You're like 9 nights of like church of mass, but
Mhm.
basically it's like you would go to mass, and then afterwards there'd be parties after,
Oh.
there would be like food and vendors and partying, and then you would continue that up until the huge party on Christmas Eve.
Mm.
So it's a lot of like, yes, there's a lot of like church aspects, but there's a lot of like celebrations as well.
Hmm. You also bring in something which I really identify with, which is the idea of Christmas cookies, though with a Filipino twist. Can you talk a little bit about those and how you develop the recipes for the book?
Sure. I mean, when you think Christmas, it's hard not to think of cookies, right? And so I really enjoy baking. Coming up with recipes for the series is honestly one of the most fun parts. Like who knew, like, making dozens of cookies is considered research. And so I tried to think of cookies that are considered traditional around at least like American Christmas celebrations. So like shortbread, snickerdoodles, things like that. And then I'm like, how, like, what could, you're like decorated sugar cookies, like that kind of a thing. And I was
Mhm.
like, what kind of spin can I add to them to incorporate, traditionally Filipino ingredients and things like that. Snickerdoodles are probably one of my favorite cookies, like probably like a top 3 cookie for me.
Yeah.
And so because of the spice mixing, it was a natural pick for salabat, which is like a kind of ginger tea in the Philippines. So the way I make it, at least, it involves ginger and cinnamon, and I add some other like spices and sweeten it. And I'm like, oh, of course, like if I can take a regular snickerdoodle and add a little bit of ginger, a little bit of cayenne to spice it up. And I made them squares as opposed to like, because
Mhm.
rolling each individual cookie is a little tedious, especially
Yeah.
like if you're baking for a business around the holidays. um so I'm like, for the ease of use, I made them squares. I just took the flavors that I really loved and made, and incorporated that. There's another one like pandan crinkles. So like in book 1 it has ube crinkles, ube being a purple yam, which is really common for us. Pandan is like, we call it like Southeast Asian vanilla. It's a kind of plant that we use to flavor and scent just about everything. It's kind of like a grassy floral vanilla coconut flavor. Very fragrant. It's a delicious flavor. And the coloring is usually green. I'm like, oh, Christmas green.
Mhm.
And so I kind of naturally went with that as well. So also think about things like that, like visually, what else screams Christmas? So, and just like lots of little things like that.
Let's talk a little bit about the genre you write in, cozy
Hmm.
mysteries, specifically culinary cozy mysteries. What do you think are the necessary ingredients in a good cozy mystery series? How would you define cozies?
So the really simple way that I like to define cozies for people who are new to it is that there is no graphic violence, sex, or bad language on the page. I think that's like the one thing that everyone can like, agree upon, right? Yeah, everyone's like, is Agatha Christie a cozy? Is it? Like, but at least the very least, those three things are what are agreed upon. Um, I would add that most contemporary cozies, at least, rely very heavily on um its cast of characters,
Mhm.
right? Like not just like a strong protagonist that you want to, I hate using the word likable because especially because we're always talking about women when it comes to this, but the idea of, it's supposed to
Identifiable, yeah.
okay, identifiable. Okay, that's a good one. Because again, like these are not meant to be, like like a noir, like, oh, unlikable, hard, like they're meant to be fun, like, oh wow, I would want to be that person's friend, or
Yeah.
like that
Mhm.
kind of a feeling. And with a large cast of characters who tend to be maybe on the quirky side, just, the kind of fun, like you
Mhm.
want that feeling of like, oh, I'd love to hang out with these people, I'd love to meet them. Same goes for the setting. um it's not always a small town. Like for example, like Jen McKinley, like hers are set, I believe, in Scottsdale.
Yeah, but
um
it's an enclosed setting because it's a bakery, so you kind of get
mhm.
that circle
But you
of,
still get the small community feel,
yeah,
right? Same thing with Olivia Black. She wrote like the Brooklyn murder mysteries, and you don't think
yes,
like, like New York. That
yeah.
doesn't, but because it takes place in a community,
Mhm.
right? um
Neighborhood, yeah.
the neighborhood, right? You need that feeling there, where like the setting is almost a character in itself.
That's good.
And kind of like like I would say those are the two things that I could never negotiate on, right? But but like the sprinkles, right? The like to add a little bit of flavor. Usually there's like a quote unquote gimmick, right? Like
Mhm.
culinary cozies are centered around food, but there's also big ones on like crafting and, gardening and all the different kinds of things. And it doesn't hurt if you have a pet.
Mhm.
Cozy readers really love their animals, especially because they know nothing bad will ever happen to them. So,
That's another unbroken rule, yeah.
yeah,
Um,
Longanisa the dog is hands down the most popular character in my series. Not all the people I've cracked these, these intricate backstories for and these character no, the dog, the dog with a pun name.
I think you've really identified the key elements. What I think you and some other authors are bringing to the cozy genre is kind of a new freshness. You're looking at it from
Mhm,
a younger perspective. Um,
mhm,
I think it's important that readers also know that what I think you're trying to do is also bring in characters so that every reader sees themselves. Because let's
mhm,
be honest, prior to probably to about 2000, most cozies had a certain kind of
mhm.
protagonist.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely why I wanted to write in the genre. Again, like, my mom is the one who got me into cozies, and I started reading very voraciously once I got introduced to this world, and I never saw myself, or even like the people around me. It didn't reflect my world at all, and so that's what I'm doing. I am simply reflecting myself in the world that I see, as a queer woman of color who, from, again, I'm from Chicago, which is like a very um, mixed place. Like I know people from all, walks of life, all different, ethnicities, religions, like it's all different kinds of things.
Mhm.
And, some people will be like, oh, it's like you have a checklist, like you have a this and a that and a that. I'm like, no, these are just people that exist in the world, that exist in my world, that I've never gotten to see. And I want to make sure that others don't have to do that, especially for the younger readers who are coming up.
Mhm. Um, some authors do draw upon their friends, neighbors,
Mhm.
relatives, acquaintances for inspiration. Is that something that you do? And if so, has anybody ever said, that's me in the book?
I very carefully make it sure so that the people can't say that's me.
No.
What I often do is I will like maybe the conversation, or something like that. It's like, because some of the things that the auntie, like that the calendar crew says, some of those things have been said to me, or they've been said to friends of mine who are like venting to me about their stories. But what I'll do is like I'll take a quality or a characteristic that the people in my life have that I find very interesting. And then I'll build a different kind of character all around it. Like, so for example, like Tita Rosie, her big thing is food as a love language, right? So much of my book is that, food doesn't just mean food. There's so many different layers that of meaning that are hidden in there. And hers in particular is food as a love language. She is not a physically affectionate person. She's not verbally affectionate, right? She doesn't say I love you every other day. If you'll maybe get an I love you once a year if you're lucky. But the care that she shows in trying to feed you and nurture you and take care of you, that's where it is. And so that quality is something that I recognized in my father when I got much older, right? Like no one would ever read the book and be like, oh, that was your dad. Like, no, nobody would see that. But because I recognized that quality in my father and found it so interesting to have someone who could be so loving, but so like silent about it in a way, right? And in a way that maybe you don't recognize as a child, that makes you wonder about certain things. Especially if you're growing up in the US where you see like on TV the people, all the I love yous and the hugs and the kisses, and you're like, oh, that's not what my family looks like. But realizing that there's so many different kinds of love, I wanted to explore that. And so that character of Tita Rosie is based heavily on my father, even though even my mom reads all my books. Like she would not have pinpointed my dad. So I do things like that. I think like, oh, this is a defining quality. This is something I consider a defining quality in you. And I want to use it, good or bad, and I want to use it to build this other kind of character.
Actually, two of the things that you also bring into the series that are important are the idea of food, which you've talked about in the Filipino culture. For someone who might not be familiar, like myself, before I read the books, what can you tell us about Filipino culture, about their food that we need to know or we should know?
Well, a lot of times, so I grew up in a working class majority Latina neighborhood. So I didn't grow up in a large Filipino community that like similar to the one I gave Lila. That was an imagined one for her. I only had my family. And so for the longest time, I wasn't sure like how much is my family, how much is this like, like a cultural thing. But I didn't. So it's really hard for me to like separate those two things. My parents and my grandparents didn't teach me and my brothers the language, the Tagalog language. I can understand it because they would talk it amongst themselves, and like I grew up listening to it, but I cannot speak it. My family, sadly, were not really storytellers. I don't really know much about their history or the history, but we had the food and we had certain other things that they kind of held on to and passed down to us. And so, I always wondered, I'm like, oh, is like this obsession with food just because like it's all that I had growing up? But then, I met other Filipinos and also other Filipino creators and other Filipino writers. And we noticed it was like a shared thread in our books that even Filipino writers who were not writing culinary, I don't really know anyone who's writing culinary, but they were writing like middle grade fantasy or contemporary or this or that or adult sci-fi. There would still be heavy food elements in their books. And so we had a panel about it and we talked about it. And someone pointed out that a common greeting in the Philippines is kumain ka na ba? Have you eaten?
Oh.
Right? It's not, not hi, hello, how are you doing? If someone comes over to your house, one of the first things they'll ask you is, have you eaten? Right? And even if the answer is yes, I have, we're still going to serve you food. It's this gesture of hospitality kind of a thing. And I don't know what it is specifically, but so much of our days revolve around food, especially when I was visiting family there. Like we would have breakfast and a couple hours later there'd be merienda, which is like snack time. And they'd be like, oh, are you hungry? And I'm like, no. And they're like, okay, well, here you go. I'm like, well, all right. And I guess I'll eat again. And then there'd be lunch. And then a few hours later, it'd be merienda. And then there'd be dinner. And then, and so like so much of the family time is spent sitting around, like having like coffee and gossiping and having a meal together. And so much of like community family time is spent around sharing a meal and sharing your day or gossip or this or that. And so I think that's part of it. That's why my favorite and some like usually my most difficult scenes are like the dinner scenes.
Yeah.
Because in the books, like it's not just Lila investigating, it's everyone in her life kind of helping her out. And so they'll gather at these big meals
Hmm.
where they're sharing information for the investigation, but there's also all these different layers of other things going on. I don't know what it is about it. There's just something about like the dinner table that that really kind of brings things out, whether it's, conflict, of course, because like, uh just because you love them doesn't mean it's going to be easy, or information, or like a deeper understanding of something. But food is very, very central.
And the Filipino cuisine, there's a lot of other cultural influences in it, like Spain and
Hmm.
other places.
Yeah, so Spain colonized the Philippines for over 300 years. There was the Japanese occupation during World War II. There was the U.S. Colonization
Mhm.
after that. China being so close and being a heavy trade partner. Mexico was also a trade partner for a while, I've learned recently. So there's like so much of that. Um, so like, adobo is an example where it's a
Mhm.
Spanish word. So a lot of people are like, oh, is this like a Spanish, like Latino book? I'm like, no, because there is like adobo in Spanish cooking, but theirs is a seasoning, while ours is more of a style of cooking.
Hmm.
Um, hamasa and halo halo. Halo halo is like our national dessert, which is kind of like a shaved ice parfait,
Mhm.
which is both a Japanese influence, because the Japanese like shaved ice that they would bring over, but also a US influence, because so many of our desserts um, rely on canned goods. So like canned evaporated milk is like, we don't use fresh milk. We don't use coconut milk, even though we have so much for that dessert. We use canned evaporated milk. We use canned preserved things, canned for, fruit cocktail is a common one,
Hmm.
canned condensed milk. Those are all like heavy influence. Spam. I'm having spam for lunch actually. And that's a huge, US influence where, you wouldn't consider spam a Filipino food, but it
Mhm.
very much is,
Hmm.
due to that military influence. Um, so there's like lots of ways you can kind of track the names of foods, right? A lot of them tend to have like a Spanish sound
Mhm.
or a Chinese sound. So yeah, it's just a huge way station there.
And what exactly is bibingka for those that might not be familiar with it?
So bibingka is a type of rice cake that is served year round, but most particularly around the Christmas holidays. And it is usually served poured into like a banana leaf lined mold. And if you're gonna do it very, very old school traditional, like they do in the Philippines, like the street vendors, it's grilled over charcoal. So like there's like a smoky essence that kind of gets into it. Obviously most modern cooks just, I made it in the oven when I was testing out the recipes. Um, and usually, on top you can top with like butter, sugar, cheese, salted duck. It's like all they just, there's usually some sort of topping, at least like a sweet and savor, sweet and salty is a common flavor combination
Hmm.
in the Philippines. And so like usually it's topped with something that's at least a little bit sweet, but sometimes there's some salty elements brought in too.
Let's switch gears and talk about your writing process in general for the series.
Mhm.
Mysteries have a very definite structure. I mean, there is a crime that occurs. The detective, the sleuth, follows clues, finds the perpetrator. So
Mhm.
you need that structure written into the stories. Are you a structured writer? Does that come naturally, or do you find yourself kind of making it up as you go along?
No, I believe in the structure. So with this series, my interest is not in like deconstructing the cozy or like breaking ground, like I wanted to show, because one of the reasons that the earlier book that never sold, it wasn't a cozy, but it was a traditional mystery in that it was an amateur sleuth. um some of the most common feedback that we got was that we love is we can't sell it.
Uh,
um there were notes that the traditional mystery readers were older white women, and that there would be no audience for
mhm.
younger Filipino, especially Filipino queer protagonists and stories. Um, this was only like in 2018, 2019. That was not that long ago.
Hmm.
And so with the cozy mystery, I wanted to show. that yes, we do belong here. That I can write a story that, like, you know, like you look at it front and back, there's nothing about it that is not a cozy. It perfectly fits within the structure. It fits the confines. It checks all the marks. If we were going to do a cozy checklist like we did earlier,
Mhm.
the only thing different is a different point of view that we don't normally get to see, right? So like I was very I intentionally chose to work within that space. And so, and so, you know, what I do is I try to, like, I like making my mysteries more character driven. As you know, it's like I talked, you know, I rely very heavily on that, but I do want to honor that, you know, people who are picking up expect a mystery. So I
Mhm.
do
Yeah.
also try to check, like, well, yes, this family drama is riveting to me.
Mhm.
Yes, I love describing the food, but at the end of the day, it's a mystery and I need to honor that. So I do make sure I hit certain investigative beats or certain genre expectations. You know, it's never going to be like, oh, wow, at the end of the day, someone else solved it for her. Like, oh, good for her. And like, you know, I try to make sure she's as active as possible. That's usually where I have the most trouble. That's where I spent so much time revising. But it is important to me that I hit certain structural beats for that reason. For the readers who, you know, deserve to get what they're expecting, but also to prove that, like, yes, we absolutely, there's no reason
Mhm.
that, you know, protagonists like mine can't exist within the genre. There's nothing inherently older and white about the cozy genre.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very true. Now that you're into a series, does that present new challenges for you as a writer? Because there's always that kind of balance between how do you reach the reader who may be picking up book three but not read one and two versus those that have been along from the very beginning.
Oh, absolutely. You know, in some ways it's easier because I've got, by this point, I know the world so well.
Mhm.
Oh, excuse me.
That's right.
You know, I know most of the characters so well, even though I'm continuously learning new things about them, you know, thank goodness, it makes it interesting.
Mhm.
But it is that balance, especially in the opening chapters where, you know, you don't want to just like throw a new reader into the deep end, be like, wow, why is this author acting like these are people I should know and care about when they're not taking the time to explain. But but for the readers who've been along the way, or for like so when I started reading cozies, I'm the kind of person who likes to binge. So I was like, oh wow, there's already 10 books in this series. I'm going to check all 10 out from the library and read them in a row. And you know, and like again, that can get real, that's when you
Yeah.
really notice, like, okay, I know who that person. And so that's when you see the authors who do it really well, and you see the authors who are just kind of like, oh man, they're on book 20. It's getting
Yeah.
real tough for them, you know. And so I try to keep that in mind. And so like I always try to, I mean, luckily I've already done three. I'm waiting for edits on book 4. I've um outlined, you know, book 5 already. And so it's that I try to set it in scene
Mhm.
where it makes sense for me to explain the relation of the person without being too much like, as you know, business partner of mine, you know.
Yeah.
Like it's that it's really tough, because especially because, you know, each book is technically a standalone, but you also want people to enjoy the character development from other things. So it's definitely a balancing act.
You've mentioned there's going to be more books in the series.
Yes. So my contract was originally for 3 books, but luckily I've done well enough that Berkeley, my publisher, has contracted me for 3 more.
Oh, that's
So
great.
so book 4 is titled Murder and Mammon, and that's going to come out early next fall, I believe. And then there's going to be 2 more books after that. And after that, who knows?
That's true. You never know. Um, are there any plans for you to branch off into something different, or you're going to stick with Leela for the being,
So right now,
or is
I
it?
love this series. I'm very happy with it, but there are other stories I want. So like, I don't want to necessarily like abandon it. But there are other. So like, I'm working on like a YA mystery. I'm
Oh,
working on next year. I have a short story in an anthology that's coming out, I believe, next summer. I don't have a specific due date for that either. Um, it's called Fit for the Gods, I believe the anthology is called, and it's each story is a reimagining of story from Edith Hamilton's
oh, great.
mythology.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. How fascinating.
And so I took on the Furies and I reimagined them as Filipino siblings running a detective agency that specializes in family drama and revenge. And
Wow.
so, I really like amateur sleuth, but I also like PIs. And so like this short story was a fun way for me to be like, oh, is there like novel potential in this? Maybe,
Mhm.
so it's, again, I haven't done anything with that yet. Like it's right now, it's currently just that short story that's going to be in the anthology, but that's also another avenue where I'm like, well, if it gets good traction, maybe that is something I can expand and work on as well. And of course, the story that I never sold, it's not dead to me. I'm hoping to eventually revise it and try to send it out again, but time.
Um, You've mentioned some of your favorite books and authors like Mary Higgins Clark.
hmm
Are there any others you'd like to share? Any newer authors that you're, as you would say, binging on?
My current favorite is Sherry Thomas and the Lady
Oh, yeah,
Sherlock series. I don't
yeah.
understand how every book gets better, like how she just continuously gets better. They're so good. They combine, like what you're expecting from a Sherlock Holmes story, but from a gender bent perspective, as well as like a really great slow burn romance, which I'm into.
Hmm.
She kind of she does it all. Like she checks all the boxes for me. So Sherry Thomas, I mentioned Kelly Garrett earlier.
Hmm.
Um, her release earlier this year was like a sister. If it was more of a domestic suspense than her earlier amateur sleuth work. Um,
Yeah, she did the Hollywood Sleuth one, I think.
yeah, the Hollywood Homicide and
Yeah,
Hollywood Endings.
yeah.
Another newer author who's Nikesa Afia. So her last year was her debut with Dead Girls. This year, Harlem
That's right.
Sunset came out.
Wow, the
Yeah.
1920s.
Yes, it's set in 1920s Harlem. It stars a young black lesbian who is just trying to get on with her life, and she gets, pulled in for very serious. It's not, despite the cover, which are gorgeous, they're not cozies.
Yeah.
The first book involves her helping to track down a serial killer who is targeting young black women like her.
Mhm.
Um, and the second one, it's she has a pretty harrowing past that she's tried, which is part of the reason like she acts the way she does now to get away from it. But a woman from her past turns up dead, and her girlfriend is the main suspect, and so she's pulled back into these things. And so um, it's a really interesting series that and the character Louise Lloyd is like fantastic. I think would make like it's so visually sumptuous. Like I would love to see it on the screen.
Yeah, I never thought of that, but you're right. Yeah, it would really
hmm
translate well.
hmm
Before we run out of time and we're rapidly approaching that point, how can readers learn more about you and your books? Do you have a website? Are you on particular social media platforms?
Yes, so I have a website which is just my full author name, miapmanansala.com. I also have a monthly newsletter where I give like news and events. I share a recipe. I usually do book giveaways and book spotlights every month, um, which you can sign up for my site as well. And I'm fairly active on Twitter and Instagram, not super active on Facebook, but the handles are the same all across all my social media, which is at MPM the writer. So MPM, my initials, MPM the writer.
That's great. We now have reached the point where we're going to have to say goodbye to Mia. Before we conclude, I want to thank her for taking time to visit with the Poison Pen. Her new book is Blackmail and Bibingka. It's truly a wonderful, cozy mystery, but also a truly wonderful novel that brings you into a different world and culture. And I want to thank those of you who are listening into another author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.